Picture this. You are a distinguished Roman senator, one of the most respected men in the empire. Your family name stretches back for generations. Your toga bears the purple stripe of nobility, and you've devoted decades to serving Rome with honor. Tonight, you receive a golden invitation to dine with the emperor, an honor that should fill you with pride. Yet, as you climb the marble steps of the Palatine Hill Palace, your stomach twists with dread. The guards at the entrance avoid your eyes. They know exactly what you are walking into, and their silence says everything. The fragrance of precious incense drifts through the air, but it cannot mask something else. Fear, thick and suffocating. You step into the great hall, where dozens of Rome's elite have already gathered. Senators with their wives, wealthy merchants, military commanders, all stand in tense, uncomfortable silence. Then you hear it, the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor, accompanied by manic laughter that chills your blood. Emperor Caligula appears, draped in silk shimmering like liquid gold. His eyes burn with a disturbing intensity as he surveys the room like a predator sizing up its prey. He claps his hands with theatrical delight, his voice booming against the marble walls. My dear friends, tonight we shall see who among you truly loves your emperor. Tonight we shall discover just how far you will go to prove your loyalty. From that moment on, what follows shatters every boundary of Roman decency. The sacred halls of power are transformed into a stage for the emperor's darkest appetites. This is the story of how one man's madness corrupted an entire empire. The story of how absolute power became absolute corruption. Before we dive into these forgotten tales of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It's truly remarkable that we can explore these ancient stories together, from different corners of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how the most powerful man on earth could transform his palace into a den of depravity and psychological torment, you have to understand how Caligula became emperor in the first place. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 CE, he earned the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots. As a child, when he accompanied his father Germanicus on military campaigns, dressed in miniature soldier's gear, he charmed the legions. But childhood for a member of the imperial family was anything but innocent. By the age of 7, Caligula had witnessed the mysterious death of his father, possibly from poisoning ordered by Emperor Tiberius. He then watched his mother, Agrippina the Elder, and his brothers vanish into exile, imprisonment, and eventually death, victims of the paranoid machinations of imperial politics. Imagine being a child and knowing that at any moment a knock at your door could be your last. Caligula learned to survive in a world where showing weakness meant certain death, where trust was a luxury no one could afford. He became a master of deception, presenting himself as harmless while his family was systematically destroyed around him. This early trauma would later manifest in his compulsive need to dominate and humiliate others, especially those who reminded him of the power structures that had terrorized his youth. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, the Roman people welcomed the 24-year-old Caligula as emperor with genuine joy. He was the son of their beloved Germanicus, the boy who had once charmed the armies. After decades of suffering under the paranoid recluse Tiberius, Rome was ready for someone young, someone who promised to restore the glory days. And for 7 months, Caligula seemed to be everything they had hoped for. He recalled political exiles, granted generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and held spectacular public games. The people adored him. But then, something changed, something that would transform the Imperial Palace. From a seat of governance into a playground for the emperor's most twisted fantasies. In late 37 CE, Caligula fell gravely ill with what ancient sources describe as a brain fever. The illness was so severe it brought the empire to a standstill. For days, he hovered between life and death while Rome held its breath, praying for the survival of their young emperor. Some historians believe this illness caused permanent brain damage, while others argue it simply stripped away the thin veneer of sanity that had been holding his darker impulses in check. When Caligula recovered, those closest to him noticed the change immediately. The young man who had once shown restraint and political wisdom was gone. In his place stood someone who seemed to have lost all connection to reality, all sense of boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the acceptable and the unthinkable. The transformation wasn't immediately obvious to the public. It began with small things: excessive spending, unusual behavior in private meetings, increasingly erratic decisions. But behind the closed doors of the Imperial Palace, a much darker change was taking shape. Caligula had discovered something during his brush with death, the intoxicating realization that, as emperor, he could do literally anything to anyone, and no one could stop him. The palace staff were the first to witness Caligula's transformation. Servants who had faithfully served the imperial family for years suddenly found themselves subjected to the emperor's bizarre whims and sexual demands. Young male slaves were particularly vulnerable, summoned to his chambers and forced to participate in acts that violated every notion of Roman dignity. But it was the female servants who suffered the most. Ancient sources, written in the careful and restrained language of their time, describe how the emperor would prowl the palace corridors at night, selecting women at random to satisfy his appetites. These were not consensual encounters, they were acts of pure dominance, designed to reinforce Caligula's absolute power over everyone in his domain. And his appetites were not limited to servants. Caligula began inviting the wives of senators and other high-ranking officials to private audiences, ostensibly to discuss their husbands' careers or family affairs. These women, raised in the strict moral codes of Roman aristocracy, suddenly found themselves trapped in situations where refusing the emperor's advances could mean death not only for themselves, but for their entire families. One particularly chilling account describes how Caligula would force these women to strip naked and perform various sexual acts while he sat watching from his throne. Sometimes, he brought in multiple women at once, making them compete for his attention. The psychological torture was as deliberate as the physical abuse. These proud Roman matrons, once women of dignity, honored and respected across the empire, were reduced to little more than sexual playthings for the emperor's amusement. What made Caligula's transformation of the palace particularly horrifying wasn't just the abuse itself, but how methodically he wielded sex as a weapon to dismantle Rome's social order. He understood that by forcing the empire's most respected citizens to participate in or even witness acts of sexual degradation, he could shatter their spirits more completely than any conventional torture ever could. The emperor began hosting elaborate dinner parties. At first, they resembled traditional gatherings of Rome's elite. Senators attended with their wives and daughters, and the evening would open with music, food, and conversation. But inevitably, these events descended into orgies. Caligula would begin with seemingly casual remarks, sonador Marcus he might say, his tone light, as if requesting more wine. "Your wife has such beautiful eyes. I wonder what they would look like when she's on her knees before me." And the senator would have no choice but to sit in silence, knowing that even the smallest protests could condemn his entire family to execution. Meanwhile, his wife would be compelled to obey whatever sexual command the emperor demanded, often with her husband and children forced to watch in helpless horror. The psychological damage to these families was devastating. Marriages collapsed, children were scarred for life, and once proud Roman bloodlines were humiliated and broken, reduced to instruments of Caligula's perverse entertainment. He took particular delight in ensuring the humiliation was absolute. Senators were positioned so they had a clear, unobstructed view of their wives being forced into sexual acts, performing oral sex, or being compelled to submit to the emperor or to those he designated as his partners. The men's faces twisted between rage and despair were to Caligula part of the spectacle. Helplessness and shame seemed to provide Caligula with as much satisfaction as the sexual acts themselves. The Imperial Palace complex on the Palatine Hill was even physically altered to accommodate his increasingly elaborate fantasies. He commissioned special chambers designed specifically for group sexual activities, complete with elaborate staging and viewing areas. Ancient architectural fragments suggest rooms where ordinary furniture had been replaced with couches arranged in circles, allowing maximum visibility of the acts from multiple angles. One chamber, according to surviving accounts, resembled a miniature amphitheater, with raised seating built around a central space where the emperor staged his sexual performances, captured enemies, slaves, and sometimes even Roman citizens were forced to engage in these acts. While audiences of senators and their families were compelled to watch and applaud, Caligula's own bedroom became a source of dread for everyone in the palace. Unlike the private quarters of past emperors, his chamber was fitted with viewing areas and multiple entrances, making it possible to bring in audiences at will. He seemed to take as much pleasure in being observed as in the acts themselves, treating intercourse as a public demonstration of his absolute power within the palace walls. Caligula also established what can only be described as a brothel staffed by the wives and daughters of senators who had fallen from favor. These women were forced to serve not only the emperor but also his guests, foreign dignitaries, and at times even common soldiers. It was humiliation elevated to imperial policy. Caligula himself often presided over these scenes, giving instructions and commentary like a theater director orchestrating a performance. Perhaps most shocking of all was how Caligula entwined sexual degradation with Rome's most sacred institutions. Religious rites that had been performed with solemn dignity for centuries were twisted into opportunities for humiliation. Even formal sessions of the Senate were not spared. On occasion, the emperor would demand that senators' wives perform sexual services while their husbands carried out official business. The sacred act of governance became inseparable from sexual degradation, with Rome's most important political decisions being made as the empire's most powerful men were forced to watch their families abused. Religious ceremonies were similarly corrupted. Caligula declared himself divine and demanded that rituals include sexual acts performed in his honor. Priestesses who had taken vows of chastity were forced into public intercourse as part of worship, while traditional religious festivals devolved into elaborate orgies, featuring unwilling participants from Rome's noble families. The emperor's marriages became infamous spectacles. He wed and divorced multiple times, often within days, using each wedding as a stage for humiliation. In one chilling account, Caligula forced a bride's father to watch as he consummated the marriage in front of the entire wedding party, transforming the sacred act into a public display of conquest. But Caligula's appetites went far beyond personal gratification. They became instruments of economic terror against Rome's wealthiest families. The emperor targeted the most beautiful wives and daughters of the nobility, demanding sexual access to them in exchange for their family's survival and prosperity. This created a grotesque marketplace of power, where nobles were compelled to offer their female relatives as currency for political favor or simply for protection. Invitations to private audiences arrived like death sentences, for everyone knew what they entailed, yet refusal meant ruin. Caligula went further still, establishing what amounted to a system of sexual taxation. Wealthy families were required to surrender their women for periods of service within the palace, with the length and frequency determined by their financial status. This was no prostitution in the traditional sense. It was sexual slavery codified, ritualized, and enforced at the very heart of the Roman Empire. Imposed on the empire's most privileged classes as a demonstration of absolute imperial power, women who resisted or tried to escape these arrangements faced horrific punishments. Some were forced to perform public sexual acts as entertainment during gladiatorial games. Others were sold into actual prostitution, their noble status stripped away as they were made to serve as common soldiers and slaves. The message was unmistakable. No one, regardless of birth, wealth, or status, was beyond the emperor's sexual reach. For the women forced into Caligula's sexual theater, the impact was devastating and long-lasting. These were women raised under the rigid moral codes of Roman aristocracy, taught that their virtue was their most sacred possession, and that their duty was first to their families and then to the empire. Suddenly, they were reduced to objects for the emperor's amusement. The psychological trauma stretched far beyond the physical abuse. Many were compelled to perform acts that violated not only their dignity, but also their deepest religious beliefs. The cognitive dissonance between their upbringing and their forced participation in debasement often led to complete psychological collapse. Some women chose suicide rather than submit to Caligula's demands. But the emperor anticipated this. Families of women who killed themselves were punished collectively, sometimes by execution, other times by financial ruin that obliterated entire bloodlines. This left women trapped in an impossible position, torn between preserving their personal honor and protecting their families. Every choice led to destruction. Caligula seemed to derive particular pleasure from breaking the spirits of women who initially resisted him. He subjected them to increasingly degrading acts until their will was shattered, their resistance crushed. These women were paraded as examples, living warnings of what awaited those who dared defy the emperor's will. Perhaps even more psychologically devastating was the forced complicity of Roman men in their families' humiliation. Senators and other high-ranking officials were not merely passive witnesses to their wives' and daughters' abuse. They were often required to participate actively in arranging and facilitating these encounters. Caligula would demand that fathers personally deliver their daughters to his chambers, that husbands assist in preparing their wives for sexual encounters, or that brothers help restrain their sisters during group sexual activities. This forced participation created a level of psychological trauma that went beyond simple witnessing. These men became accomplices in their own family's destruction. The emperor understood that, by making these men complicit in the sexual abuse of their loved ones, he was destroying their ability to maintain any sense of personal honor or dignity. The senator, who had helped to tie his own wife down for the emperor's pleasure, could never again command the same respect in the Roman Senate. His authority was permanently compromised by his participation in his family's degradation. Some men attempted to resist by refusing to bring their female relatives to palace gatherings, but Caligula had prepared for this as well. Families who failed to comply with sexual demands faced immediate execution, often carried out in public as a warning to others. The choice was simple: participate in your family's sexual abuse, or watch them die. One of the most disturbing aspects of Caligula's sexual reign of terror was his inclusion of children in palace activities. While ancient sources are understandably vague about specific details, they make clear that the emperor's sexual appetites extended to minors, both male and female, from Rome's most prominent families. Children who were brought to palace gatherings were forced to witness sexual acts that no child should see, creating psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Some were forced to participate in sexual activities themselves, their innocence destroyed, as part of the emperor's campaign to corrupt every aspect of Roman society. The long-term impact on these children was devastating. Many grew up unable to form normal relationships, their understanding of sexuality forever warped by their childhood experiences in the Imperial Palace. Others became perpetrators themselves, carrying forward the cycle of sexual abuse. As they reached adulthood and positions of power, Caligula seemed to understand that by sexually traumatizing the children of Rome's elite, he was ensuring that his corruption would outlast his own reign. These children would grow up to be the next generation of Roman leaders, but they would carry with them the psychological scars of their experiences in the palace, potentially perpetuating cycles of abuse for decades to come. As his reign progressed, Caligula began to formalize his sexual practices into a kind of religious cult centered around imperial worship. He declared himself a living god and demanded that sexual acts performed in his honor be treated as religious rituals. This wasn't mere megalomania, it was a calculated attempt to legitimize his sexual abuse by cloaking it in religious authority. Temples were established within the palace complex, where worshippers were required to engage in sexual acts as demonstrations of devotion to the divine emperor. These weren't voluntary religious practices, they were mandatory sexual performances, required of anyone seeking imperial favor or simply trying to avoid imperial wrath. The emperor created elaborate ceremonies around his sexual activities, complete with formal protocols and ritualistic elements. Sexual intercourse with the emperor or his designated representatives became a form of communion with the divine, while watching these acts became a form of worship to required of palace visitors. This religious framework provided Caligula with justification for even his most extreme sexual demands. When senators' wives were forced to engage in group sexual activities, it was presented as a religious obligation, rather than mere imperial whim. When children were included in sexual rituals, it was described as initiating them into divine mysteries, rather than child abuse. Caligula's sexual terrorism wasn't limited to the palace itself. It extended throughout the empire, through a network of officials who carried out similar practices in his name. Provincial governors, military commanders, and other imperial representatives were encouraged to establish their own versions of the emperor's sexual court, creating an empire-wide system of sexual exploitation and abuse. These local officials understood that their continued favor with the emperor depended on their willingness to participate in and facilitate sexual abuse. They competed with each other to devise increasingly creative forms of sexual humiliation, sending reports back to Rome detailing their innovations in the hope of gaining imperial recognition. The result was an empire where sexual abuse became a standard tool of governance. Local populations lived in constant fear that their wives, daughters, or sons might be selected for sexual service to imperial officials. This created a climate of terror that extended far beyond the palace walls, affecting millions of people throughout the Roman world. Women throughout the empire learned to live with the knowledge that their bodies were not their own, that at any moment they might be claimed by imperial representatives for sexual purposes. This systematic sexual terrorism became one of the defining characteristics of Caligula's reign, leaving psychological scars that would affect Roman society for generations. By 40 CE, Caligula's sexual excesses had reached levels that shocked even those who had witnessed his earlier depravities. Palace gatherings had devolved into elaborate sexual spectacles that could last for days, with hundreds of participants forced to engage in increasingly extreme acts. The emperor's final months were marked by sexual performances of an unprecedented scale and cruelty. He would stage massive orgies involving senators, their families, foreign dignitaries, slaves, and even animals, creating sexual tableaux that served as demonstrations of his absolute power over human dignity and morality. These final performances seemed designed not just for personal gratification, but as statements about the nature of imperial power itself. By forcing Rome's most respected citizens to participate in the most degrading sexual acts, Caligula was making a philosophical point about the meaninglessness of traditional Roman values. In the face of absolute authority, the breaking point came when Caligula announced his intention to make his sexual practices the official religion of the empire, requiring all Roman citizens to participate in sexual rituals as demonstrations of loyalty. This threat to formalize and universalize his sexual terrorism was what finally convinced the conspiracy against him to act. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard in the underground passages of his own palace. But even in death, the emperor's sexual crimes continued to terrorize their victims. The conspiracy included not just political motivations, but personal ones. Several of the assassins had been forced to watch their own family members subjected to the emperor's sexual abuse. The new emperor, Claudius, faced the enormous task of dealing with the aftermath of Caligula's sexual reign of terror. The physical evidence of the emperor's crimes was extensive rooms equipped for sexual torture, collections of pornographic art depicting real palace victims, detailed records of sexual encounters that served as blackmail material against prominent families. Much of this evidence was quietly destroyed, not out of respect for Caligula's memory, but to protect the victims and their families from further humiliation. Rooms that had been sites of sexual abuse were sealed or completely renovated, as if the new administration was trying to erase the physical memory of what had occurred. The cover-up extended to the historical record as well. While ancient historians clearly documented Caligula's sexual crimes. They used coded language that obscured the full extent of the abuse. Many victims and their families preferred this discretion, understanding that detailed accounts of their experiences would only perpetuate their humiliation. The most tragic aspect of Caligula's sexual terrorism was how effectively it silenced its victims. The Roman social system, with its emphasis on honor and family reputation, made it nearly impossible for survivors to speak openly about their experiences without destroying what remained of their social standing. Women who had been sexually abused by the emperor faced a society that would blame them for their victimization, regardless of the circumstances. Men who had been forced to watch their wives' sexual degradation couldn't speak about their experiences without admitting their own powerlessness and complicity. Children who had witnessed or experienced sexual abuse often carried their trauma in silence. For their entire lives, this conspiracy of silence meant that the full extent of Caligula's sexual crimes may never be known. Families destroyed by sexual abuse had every incentive to hide their experiences, while historical accounts were necessarily limited by social conventions that made explicit discussion of sexual matters inappropriate for public consumption. The silence also meant that many victims never received justice or even acknowledgement of their suffering. The new imperial administration was focused on political stability rather than addressing past abuses, leaving survivors to cope with their trauma without support or recognition. The sexual crimes committed in Caligula's palace had consequences that extended far beyond his 4-year reign. The psychological trauma inflicted on Rome's elite created generational patterns of dysfunction that affected Roman society for decades to come. Children who had witnessed or experienced sexual abuse in the palace grew up with profoundly damaged understandings of sexuality, power, and human relationships. Many became perpetrators themselves, unable to distinguish between normal sexual expression and the abusive practices they had learned in childhood. Others became victims again, their childhood trauma making them vulnerable to further exploitation. The families that survived Caligula's reign often found themselves permanently marked by their experiences. Marriages destroyed by forced sexual encounters never recovered, while children raised in environments of sexual terror struggled to form healthy relationships as adults. The social fabric of Roman aristocracy was permanently damaged by the systematic sexual abuse of its most prominent members. Perhaps most significantly, Caligula's sexual terrorism established patterns of imperial abuse that would resurface throughout Roman history. Later emperors, while perhaps not matching Caligula's extremes, understood that sexual exploitation was a powerful tool for maintaining control over subordinates and eliminating political opposition. Today, tourists walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, marveling at the remnants of imperial grandeur, without fully understanding the horrors that once unfolded within these crumbling walls. The marble floors that once echoed with the screams and sobs of unwilling victims now hosts guided tours and scholarly lectures about ancient Roman architecture. But if you know what to look for, the evidence remains. Foundation stones that once supported rooms designed specifically for sexual torture, drainage systems that carried away the physical evidence of countless assaults, underground passages where terrified victims waited their turn to be summoned to the emperor's presence. The ghosts of Caligula's victims still haunt these ruins. The senator's wife, who killed herself rather than endure another night of imperial attention, the 10-year-old boy who watched his mother being sexually tortured, the proud Roman matron who was forced to work as a prostitute in the palace brothel. Their stories were deliberately erased from history, but their suffering remains. Embedded in the very stones of this place, Caligula's transformation of the Imperial Palace into a theater of sexual horror lasted less than 4 years, but its impact echoed through Roman history and continues to resonate today. The emperor's crimes remind us that sexual abuse has always been a weapon of choice, for those who seek to dominate and control others, and that the most elaborate systems of civilization can be corrupted by individuals who recognize no limits on their exercise of power. The palace may be ruins now, but its lessons endure. The systematic sexual abuse of the vulnerable by those in positions of authority isn't a relic of ancient barbarism. It's a pattern that repeats itself whenever human beings are given absolute power over others and choose to use it for evil. The only difference between Caligula's sexual terrorism and modern forms of abuse is the scale and the documentation. The fundamental dynamics of power, control, and sexual exploitation remain disturbingly consistent across the centuries. In the end, the emperor who turned his palace into an orgy left behind more than just traumatized survivors and political chaos. He created a template for sexual terrorism that would be studied and sometimes emulated by tyrants throughout history. His legacy is written, not in marble monuments or bronze inscriptions, but in the psychological scars passed down through generations of victims, a reminder that the worst crimes are often those that destroy not just bodies but souls.